Have you ever noticed how the most unbreakable men walk in silence? They don't rush to explain themselves. They don't compete for a seat at any table, and they don't smile to ease anyone's discomfort. Still, or maybe because of that, their presence carries weight. Because when a man remains silent, lucid, and no longer plays along with the collective theater, he exposes a wound most have learned to hide behind noise. And a world addicted to performative sound finds it strange when someone stops pretending. But this man wasn't always like this. He used to be the kindest one in the group. He used to bow to be accepted. He traded pieces of himself for applause, promises, scraps of belonging. He tried to adapt to a world that celebrated edited versions but ignored his essence, until one day he couldn't keep smiling just to be included. Because most men don't break from pain, they break from emptiness. The kind of emptiness disguised as routine, as success, as relationships that demand he hide who he is just to keep being loved. But instead of collapsing, he woke up, not in anger, in clarity. And that's when he started walking alone. Not out of pride, but because most people can't handle the version of him that stopped pleasing. From that moment on, he began to carry something no one could see, but that shaped every step he took. An invisible weight, an ancestral silence. And the most powerful part is that the more alone he walks, the more solid he becomes. In this video, you'll understand why a man's collapse almost never begins with pain, but with the constant performance that demands self-betrayal. You'll witness the exact moment he stops acting, and the invisible price he pays for it. You'll see why the world rejects lucid men. You'll step into the symbolic weight he carries without ever speaking. And above all, you'll discover why, even when alone, he builds more, feels deeper, sees further, and without saying a word, becomes the most respected presence in any room. If any of this echoes inside you, maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're just waking up. It's not pain. It's the emptiness disguised as belonging. Most men don't break during a moment of extreme suffering. They break when they're surrounded by people, smiling, pretending everything is normal. It's subtle. It starts when he realizes he's only accepted if he sticks to a script, when his opinions are met with silence, when his changes unsettle people more than his mistakes ever did. He doesn't collapse from the weight of life, but from the realization that the world he thought he fit into never truly saw him. Machiavelli once said, "Appearance is everything to those who rule through fear." And many men live this way, ruling themselves out of fear of not being liked. He remembers the day he entered a room full of friends and still felt alone. It wasn't rejection. It was an invisible disconnect, jokes that no longer made sense, conversations revolving around things that felt hollow, and even if he tried to join in, it felt like he was lip-syncing a character he no longer recognized. His grandmother used to say, "Don't forget who you are just because they're clapping." But now, even the applause echoed, and that echo rang false. It's like being on a stage where the audience only claps if you repeat the same lines. The moment you improvise, the theater empties. That's the most dangerous kind of emptiness, the one that looks full of voices, compliments, invitations, connections, that vanish the second you decide to be real. Most men don't notice this until it's too late, when they've already built a life based on performance, when they already have a career, a family, a public image, but no solid identity behind it. Slowly he starts to suspect something, that maybe the respect he receives is for the role he plays, not the presence he truly carries, that maybe the love he's given depends on his silence about who he's become, and then the exhaustion sets in, not from work, but from existing in such a conditioned way. What breaks most men is this constant theater, this belonging that demands self-betrayal. But what's most dangerous is still to come. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he just stopped performing, and what seemed like just another ordinary gathering became a turning point. It wasn't a planned decision, there was no announcement. It happened in the middle of a conversation. Everyone was talking loudly, laughing, telling the same stories for the 10th time. He was there, but something inside him wasn't anymore. Someone brought up politics. Another made a joke about relationships. A third started talking about his plans like he was competing for applause. He listened in silence, not out of shyness, but because, for the first time, he realized none of it represented him anymore. He remembers one specific gesture, a toast. Everyone raised their glasses, celebrating something that, for him, had already lost meaning. He lifted his glass too, but his eyes didn't follow. They were distant. In that moment he realized he was part of a hollow social ritual, and to keep smiling would be yet another betrayal of himself. That's when he chose not to react, not to confront, just to remain silent. That silence stirred more discomfort than any argument ever could. People exchanged glances. They tried to pull him back in as if he had broken character. But it wasn't a pause. It was the end of the script. He stopped replying out of politeness, stopped laughing out of obligation, stopped seeking approval in eyes that never truly saw him. And that simple act of no longer participating in the performance was perceived as hostility. It's strange how the silence of a lucid man feels threatening, how his lack of reactivity exposes the shallowness around him. They couldn't explain it, but they felt something had shifted. They started calling him strange, cold, distant, and they weren't wrong. He had indeed cooled down, but not from anger, from clarity. The clarity that comes after the exhaustion of pretending. From that day on, he started seeing everything differently. He no longer answered on autopilot, no longer smiled out of habit, and, most importantly, he stopped accepting invitations to performances where his real presence was unwelcome. He no longer wanted to fit in. He wanted to exist, even if that meant losing the stage, even if that meant losing the applause. Clarity is an offense to those who live anesthetized. A lucid man makes people uncomfortable, not because he points fingers, but because he sees what others would rather ignore. He walks into a room and, without saying a word, reveals the excesses, the vanity games, the addictions everyone believed were well hidden. He's not there to accuse anyone, but his presence alone seems to make others justify themselves. It's as if his vision unmasks realities too fragile to be touched. This kind of man can't stand unnecessary noise. He senses when a conversation is just a mask for insecurity, when a compliment comes with a debt attached, when a friendship only survives as long as he agrees. And that perception, even in silence, becomes dangerous for those who live off appearances. He becomes a threat, not because he attacked, but because he saw. It's like walking into a smoke-filled room where everyone has gotten used to breathing poorly. But he, for some reason, starts coughing, tries to open a window, and instead of being thanked, he's resented. Because the smoke has already become part of the air. His lucidity isn't welcomed as a gift, it's seen as an attack, an unwanted reminder that there might be another way to live. And you? Have you ever felt rejected not for what you did, but simply for seeing too much? Have you noticed how certain spaces turn hostile when you stop talking and start observing? That's why the lucid man begins to withdraw, not out of arrogance, but instinct. He's already learned that confronting the system makes him the villain, that exposing the cracks doesn't lead to repair, only rejection. So he learns to ration his words, to measure his presence, to vanish when he realizes his deep gaze is being seen as a threat. It's not cowardice, it's psychic survival. And that retreat is lonely, because while others are busy exchanging validation, he's exchanging certainties for questions. While they maintain the balance of the performance, he wants to face the real, even if it destabilizes him. The clarity he carries is heavy, but the lie is heavier. And he's already made his choice, between being accepted and being whole. He chose to keep seeing. They call him cold, arrogant, distant, but no one ever asks why he pulled away. The man who doesn't break makes people even more uncomfortable than the one who collapses. Because breakdowns can be understood, they fit within the collective emotional logic. They're visible, dramatic, relatable, but the man who remains standing, silent, without seeking validation, without reacting the way they expect, becomes a mystery. And what people don't understand, they fear. What they don't fear, they reject. They try to label him. They need to protect themselves from their own insecurity. He changed. He thinks he's better than us. He lost his humility. What no one dares to admit is that maybe He simply stopped accepting the role they assigned him. He doesn't shout. He doesn't defend himself. He just watches. And the mere fact that he doesn't respond is already taken as an offense. Have you ever experienced that? That subtle distancing, and not because of a mistake, but because of clarity. When people start to disappear, not because you became worse, but because you stopped pretending to be better just to please them. And that's when the silent punishment begins. He's not excluded through words, but through silence. He's not attacked with force, but with absence. Friends start to drift away, not because he did something wrong, but because he no longer feeds the shared illusion. Relationships grow cold, not because he stopped caring, but because he can't keep betraying himself just to keep the peace. It's like a lion who stopped smiling just to be accepted among dogs. At first they praised him, domesticated, predictable, friendly. But when he starts walking with his neck high and his gaze steady, fear creeps in, because his nature returns. Not to attack, but to remind everyone he was never one of them. He was just contained. And that is unbearable to those who only accept watered-down versions of strength. The price of lucidity isn't romantic solitude, it's something far more brutal, the absence of true welcome. It's being present, yet never fully received again. It's realizing that by becoming whole, he lost his seat in the theater, where the fragmented applaud each other. The unbreakable man isn't feared for what he does. He's feared for what he represents, living proof that it's possible to leave the script and still remain standing. While everyone sees his silence as an ending, few realize that's where everything begins. Because the man who steps away from the noise isn't hiding. He's getting stronger. Each day away from the need to please, he cultivates something money can't buy, emotional control. And along with it comes invisible discipline, the routine no one sees, the workouts that aren't posted, the reading with no rush, the attention to detail, the mastery of his own language, his own impulses, his own time. He's learned that true respect doesn't come from what's displayed, it comes from what's built in the dark. That's why, while others compete for attention, he observes. While they chase validation, he sharpens his decisions. He's not chasing the spotlight, he's building structure, not chasing impact, but precision. Slowly, his posture changes, his words become fewer, his listening sharper, his steps more calculated. He's not just distant, he's becoming strategic, because only the man who stopped reacting can act with clarity. And the truth is, this man starts to rise in ways no one expected, not because he shouted louder, but because he stayed quiet long enough to hear what everyone else was trying to drown out. He sees patterns, adjusts his course, changes environments without making noise, negotiates firmly without raising his voice, closes doors that no longer respect him, and opens paths that require presence, not performance. Has it ever happened to you, to grow the moment you stopped begging? To notice how your mind cleared when the audience disappeared? How in the absence of witnesses you actually became stronger? It's in this lucid solitude that the unbreakable man develops a strength that needs no explanation. It's not magic, it's practice, it's repetition, it's emotional endurance. While others hold on to their roles, he rebuilds himself in silence, not out of pride, but because he knows the world respects what it can't decipher, and that the strongest presence is the one no one saw being forged. And when he shows up again, something feels different. Not in his voice, not in his looks, but in the air around him. And that's when the world begins to feel it, even if it doesn't know why. He walks into the room, and suddenly no one knows how to act. When a man stops pleasing, he becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is the enemy of the control others once had over him. The man who used to laugh at the right moments, agree to avoid conflict, and keep the atmosphere light, now just observes. And without saying a single word, his silent presence starts to shift the entire rhythm of the room. He doesn't need to confront anyone. The simple act of not laughing at jokes that mock his own dignity already causes discomfort. The choice to stay silent during empty conversations, conversations he used to fill just to keep the peace, now creates tension. His new posture isn't arrogance, it's clarity. But because so few people know how to deal with clarity, it gets mistaken for threat. It's the paradox of the present absence. He shows up less, speaks less, engages less. Yet, when he's there, everything changes. People choose their words more carefully, adjust their tone. They realize that the man who used to be a social cushion is now a mirror. And real mirrors don't flatter. They reveal. Places where he used to mold himself now fall silent, just because he's present. The weight in the air doesn't come from his voice. It comes from his posture. This change, although subtle, carries an almost physical weight. It's like walking into a silent temple after a loud party. Something inside people demands reverence, even if they don't know why. Because his energy no longer vibrates at the frequency of neediness. It vibrates at the frequency of truth. And truth, no matter how quiet, always demands posture from those nearby. It's not that he inspires fear. It's that he dismantles the performance. And without the stage, many no longer know who they are. His new presence doesn't need speeches or exaggerated gestures. It's like a cold draft slipping under the door, subtle but impossible to ignore. And the more he retreats into silence, the louder he echoes inside those who must pretend in order to exist. He walks alone, but every step echoes everything he left behind. By now, his silence is no longer absence. It's a language. And each time he chooses not to respond, not to justify himself, not to return to what he once was, he's grieving, silently, for all the things he had to leave behind. Friends who only spoke in labels, families who confused obedience with love, relationships that demanded edited versions of him just to stay alive. But what he carries now isn't bitterness, it's clarity, the clarity of someone who survived the collapse of his own illusion. He realizes that his strength doesn't come from what he endured, but from what he had the courage to let go of, living with less, but with truth, speaking less, but with weight, being alone, but whole. There are nights when solitude still taps him on the shoulder, but it's different now. It's no longer abandonment, it's ritual. Like the warrior who, after the war, cleans his sword in silence. He doesn't need an audience, just lucidity. Because now he knows the price of freedom is having no audience. At this stage, it's common for a strange sense of relief to mix with the emptiness, a paradoxical feeling of being stronger, even after leaving everything behind, as if the absence of old frames finally made room for something real to emerge. And even without trying, he inspires. Because men who no longer beg for belonging carry a presence that cannot be ignored. It's the presence of someone who isn't trying to be accepted, but who has accepted his own transformation. And that changes everything. You may not see him smile often. You might find him distant, hard to read, out of sync with the norm. But if you pay close attention, everything around him shifts when he walks by, because his new armor isn't made of brute strength. It's made of silence, of choices, of losses that became consciousness. He doesn't speak about what he carries, because if he did, no one would believe him. There's no space in light-hearted conversations for the kind of responsibility he quietly assumed. While others smiled for pictures, he was doing mental math. While they talked about dreams, he was solving problems he didn't create. While everyone else was growing outward, he was growing inward, holding up structures no one else could see. This man is often the first in his bloodline to break a cycle, and the last to talk about it. He cares for his parents in silence, holds together the sanity of a house on the edge of collapse, works with no room for mistakes, silently endures comparisons to men who never had to hold up an entire world without letting it fall. And yet, he remains standing, not because he's stronger, but because he chose not to pass on the pain he inherited. He carries addictions he chose not to repeat, screams he chose not to return, weaknesses he never had the right to expose. He is the man who, behind a composed expression, holds the roof with his shoulders. And he does it without telling anyone, because he knows that if he stops, everything falls, not out of pride, but because he learned that sometimes the only way to rewrite a story is to carry it to the end with dignity. If there's a silence heavier than all others, it's his. Not because of what it hides, but because of what it protects. He doesn't expect medals, he doesn't want applause, and he'd never call himself a hero. But one look into his eyes is enough to know This man carries something that can't be shared, something that shapes the world around him even when he says nothing. There's no spotlight for what he does, no audience, no manual, just an inner knowing that, even if no one ever sees it, he's holding something together. And that's enough. He didn't walk away out of pride or trauma. He walked away because he realized his presence was far too valuable to keep wasting in shallow places. He didn't scream, didn't seek revenge, didn't need to convince anyone. He just stopped pretending. And from that moment on, every silent step carried everything he refused to pass on: generational patterns, inherited addictions, unspoken wounds. This man, he's not trying to be strong. He's trying not to pass along what once nearly destroyed him. That's why he walks alone, because there comes a point when the warrior realizes the real battles aren't fought on the field, they're fought in the mind, and he chose to win them without an audience. The respect he carries now wasn't earned through speeches. It was carved through loss, forged in hard decisions, shaped by the discipline to keep going when no one was watching. What weighs on his back isn't the years, it's the sacrifices, the truths he swallowed, the bridges he had to burn just to never go back to who he used to be. Maybe on the outside he seems distant, rigid, cold, but inside he's learned how to hold up an entire world. And that changes everything. Because the unbreakable man isn't the one who never felt pain. He's the one who carries his collapse with grace and doesn't grow bitter. He grows sober. Now he watches. He watches the same rooms that once shaped him, now trying to adapt to his presence. He watches those who once disrespected him, now choosing their words carefully. He watches what remained and what was left behind. And even if no one ever fully understands what he endured, he keeps walking, not to prove anything, but because somewhere along the way he understood. The world respects the man who no longer needs to be understood. So the question isn't whether he'll ever come back. The real question is, will you keep trying to fit into places that require you to shrink yourself? Or will you walk alone until you become the kind of man who never has to ask for permission to be real? If this resonated with you, subscribe. Not out of impulse, but because maybe that same silence is starting to rise inside you too.